Welcome back to Deep History Origins. On a cold November afternoon in the year 1095, a vast crowd gathered in an open field outside the small French town of Clermont. Bishops stood wrapped in heavy robes, nobles arrived in fur-lined cloaks, knights leaned on the hilts of their swords, and ordinary farmers and labourers pressed in at the edges, all of them waiting to hear a single man speak. That man was Pope Urban II, and before the day ended, his words would set half a continent in motion. Tonight we follow that motion all the way from a quiet French field to the walls of Jerusalem and back again, through faith, through war, and through 2 centuries of consequence nobody in that crowd could have imagined. Get comfortable before we begin. If these long journeys through history help settle your mind towards sleep, a like or a subscribe is always welcome, though only offer it if it genuinely helps. And if you'd like, leave your city and your local time in the comments. A quiet way of knowing someone else is drifting off alongside you tonight. Now let your shoulders soften, let the day fall away behind you, and let yourself sink into the long, winding story of the Crusades. Urban's speech that day did not stay confined to a church council. Word of it would cross mountains and oceans and generations, and it would eventually send tens of thousands of ordinary people marching toward a war none of them fully understood. Standing before the crowd, Urban described a crisis unfolding far to the east. Fellow Christians, he said, were suffering. The Byzantine Empire, that great Christian power centered on Constantinople, had lost enormous stretches of territory to a rising force called the Seljuk Turks. Ancient churches now stood under foreign rule. Pilgrims making the long journey toward Jerusalem faced growing danger along the way. And Jerusalem itself, the city where Christians believed their faith's central events had unfolded, no longer sat under Christian control. Urban called on the fighting men of Europe to redirect their energy. Knights who had spent years locked in private feuds with their neighbours, he argued, should turn those same swords toward what he framed as a holy purpose. His appeal reached beyond the nobility too, toward the poor and the powerful alike, urging both to march east and reclaim the holy city. What made this different from an ordinary military campaign was the promise attached to it. This would be a pilgrimage as much as a war, an act of penance carrying real spiritual reward. Anyone who joined the expedition out of sincere devotion, Urban proclaimed, could receive forgiveness for their sins. That promise landed with tremendous weight in a society steeped in religious anxiety. Sin, judgment, heaven, and hell were not abstract concepts to medieval Christians. The Church shaped the rhythm of an entire life, from baptism to burial, and questions of salvation sat at the absolute center of how people understood their own existence. Suddenly, for the first time, warfare itself was being offered as a road toward redemption. The crowd took this in quietly at first. Some among them likely pictured Jerusalem as the golden city described in Scripture, distant and holy. Others thought of land, of wealth, of honor, or simply of a chance to escape the narrow limits of ordinary peasant life. Faith drove some listeners, ambition drove others, and most were probably moved by some tangled combination of both. Then, according to later accounts, a cry rose from somewhere in the crowd, and others quickly picked it up, until the words were echoing across the whole gathering, "God wills it." Whether those exact words rang out in that precise moment can't be confirmed with certainty, since the surviving accounts were written afterward and shaped by memory as much as fact. What isn't in doubt is how people responded. Vows were made on the spot. Cloth crosses got stitched onto clothing. Preachers carried Urban's call from village to village and city to city, and a message first spoken in one French field spread across the continent with startling speed. Farmers walked away from their fields. Knights sold or mortgaged whole estates to fund the journey. Families scraped together money for a trip many of them would never return from. Old men, children, the trained and the completely unprepared, all pictured themselves walking toward the holiest city in their religion. Within months, roads across Europe filled with travelers heading east, some in armor carrying weapons, others carrying little beyond a wooden cross, a handful of relics, and raw faith. Many didn't know where Jerusalem actually was. Most had never travelled farther than the nearest market town. They had no reliable maps, no guaranteed food supply, no knowledge of the languages, climates, or peoples waiting for them along the way. And still they went, through the forests of France, along German rivers, through Hungary and the Balkans, toward Constantinople, toward Asia Minor, toward Jerusalem itself. What had started as one papal appeal would grow into one of the largest movements of people in the whole medieval period. It would produce sieges and massacres, moments of genuine courage and moments of ugly betrayal, unlikely alliances and permanent ruptures. It would carve new kingdoms into the Eastern Mediterranean. It would throw Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities into violent, tangled contact. It would make some merchants rich while ruining entire noble families. It would swell the power of the papacy even as it drained Byzantium, and it would permanently reshape the relationship between East and West. And it would leave history with a single word still carrying enormous weight even now: crusade. The people who actually answered Urban's call, though, didn't use that word the way we do today. They spoke of taking the cross, of armed pilgrimage, of journeying to the Holy Sepulchre. They believed, most of them, that they were stepping into a sacred struggle. But faith alone never really shaped where the Crusades would go. Behind every sermon and every sworn vow stood kings hungry for influence, nobles hungry for land, merchant cities hungry for trade routes, and rulers desperate to hold empires together. Faith lit the fuse. War gave the movement its shape. Power decided where it would ultimately lead. And once Europe started moving east, nobody, not the Pope, not the Byzantine Emperor, not even the princes commanding the armies, could fully control what came next. This is the story of the Crusades, a story of belief, a story of bloodshed, and a story of power. And it begins not at Clermont itself, but in the decades of crisis that made Urban's speech possible in the first place. To understand why so many people were willing to abandon everything they knew in pursuit of a distant city, we first need to understand the world they were living in, a world already balanced on the edge of enormous change. Only 40 years before Urban's sermon, Christianity had suffered one of the deepest ruptures in its history. In 1054, relations between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered on Constantinople, collapsed entirely in what later became known as the Great Schism. Centuries of accumulated disagreement lay behind it: disputes over papal authority, differences of language and custom, theological arguments including the long-running Filioque controversy. Suspicion had slowly replaced cooperation between the two churches. When a papal legate placed a formal declaration of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, it made visible a division that had been building for generations. Eastern and Western Christians still shared a great deal of common belief, but they had begun to view one another through increasingly different eyes, and that division would shape everything the Crusades became. Ironically, one of Urban's own stated goals in launching the First Crusade was to help the Byzantine Empire, fellow Christians in genuine danger. The movement began, in part, as an attempt at aid. History, though, would soon carry it somewhere very different. While Christianity wrestled with its internal split, the Islamic world was undergoing its own dramatic transformation. Muslim dynasties had governed much of the Middle East for centuries by this point, and Jerusalem itself had sat under Muslim rule since the 7th century, generally allowing Christian pilgrims continued access to its holy sites. That arrangement began shifting with the arrival of a new power out of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. Originally nomadic warriors, the Seljuks had converted to Islam and expanded with startling speed through the 11th century, combining real military skill with serious political ambition. Within just a few decades, they had conquered Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and much of Anatolia, and their rise dramatically shifted the balance of power across the Eastern Mediterranean. Suddenly, the Byzantine Empire faced an opponent unlike anything it had previously encountered. Everything came to a head in 1071 near the town of Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia, where a Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos IV met the forces of the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, hoping to halt the Turkish advance and secure the empire's eastern border once and for all. The battle instead ended in catastrophe. Confusion spread through the Byzantine ranks. Some commanders abandoned the field outright, others simply misread their orders, and the emperor himself was taken captive. Modern historians still debate the precise military significance of the battle, but its political fallout was undeniable. Byzantine authority across much of Asia Minor shattered in the aftermath, and that region mattered enormously, serving as the empire's agricultural heartland, its main recruiting ground for soldiers, and one of its wealthiest provinces. As Turkish forces gradually settled the countryside, Byzantine power weakened dramatically, and for the first time in centuries, Constantinople itself began to look vulnerable. Byzantium had weathered countless invasions across its long history, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and more, yet the losses following Manzikert created a crisis of a different order entirely. In 1081, a capable soldier named Alexios Komnenos took the imperial throne, inheriting a state under enormous strain. The treasury sat nearly empty. Enemies pressed in from multiple directions at once. Seljuk Turks held much of Anatolia, while Norman forces attacked Byzantine territory from the west. The empire simply lacked the military strength to recover on its own, and Alexios needed outside help. He looked westward for it. Despite the raw tension still lingering between Rome and Constantinople, the emperor appealed directly to the Pope for military assistance, though his request was fairly modest at first, essentially asking for experienced knights who could serve as hired soldiers and help recover lost Byzantine ground. He never asked for a massive international crusade, and he certainly never imagined what his appeal would eventually set loose. Western Europe, meanwhile, was undergoing its own profound shift. Population was climbing steadily, agriculture was improving, trade routes were expanding, powerful new kingdoms were beginning to consolidate. The feudal system had produced a large class of heavily armed knights whose entire lives revolved around combat, and many of these men spent years fighting purely local wars against neighboring lords. The Church had tried repeatedly to rein in that violence through movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, urging Christians to avoid fighting on certain days or against certain groups, but these efforts had only modest success. Europe remained, at its core, a violent society. Urban recognized an opportunity hiding inside that violence. What if the restless military energy of Western Europe's warrior class could be pointed somewhere else entirely? What if knights constantly fighting each other could instead fight together for a cause capable of uniting the whole of Christendom? Byzantium's appeal offered exactly that kind of opening. At the center of everything sat one city, Jerusalem. For Christians, no other place on earth carried the same weight. According to the Gospels, Jesus had entered the city during the final week of his life, had been crucified nearby at Golgotha, had been buried, and, Christians believed, had risen from the dead within its walls. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine, had become one of Christianity's most sacred shrines, and for centuries, pilgrims had travelled from every corner of Europe to pray there, despite a journey that was long, dangerous, and expensive. They made that trip not chasing wealth or glory, but because they believed they were walking, quite literally, in the footsteps of Christ. So when stories began circulating through Europe about hardships facing those pilgrims and threats surrounding the Holy Land, stories sometimes accurate and sometimes considerably exaggerated, they struck a nerve that ran extremely deep. Jerusalem wasn't simply another distant city on a map. It was sacred history made visible and touchable, and reclaiming it wasn't merely a political goal. It was, for a great many people, a spiritual calling. By the close of the 11th century, every necessary piece had fallen into place: a divided Christian world, a Byzantine Empire fighting for its own survival, the rapid rise of the Seljuk Turks, a Western Europe growing both more populous and more militant, a papacy actively seeking greater influence, and the enduring spiritual pull of Jerusalem itself. No single one of these developments would have produced the Crusades on its own. Together, though, they created exactly the conditions needed for one of the largest and most consequential movements in the whole of medieval history. When Urban rose to speak that day at Clermont, he wasn't inventing something out of nothing. He was giving voice to forces that had been quietly building for generations, and his words would light the fuse. Once lit, those forces would reshape the medieval world in ways that no pope, no emperor, no king, and no knight could have possibly foreseen. Not everyone waited for a trained army to organize itself. Among the very first to answer Urban's call was a charismatic wandering preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Moving from village to village, Peter stirred enormous crowds with passionate sermons about Jerusalem's suffering and the glory awaiting anyone who marched to save it. His followers were a strange mix: peasants, artisans, women, children, and a smaller scattering of knights, most of them carrying little real military training and even less in the way of supplies. Driven by raw faith rather than any careful preparation, they set off months ahead of the main Crusader armies, a movement history remembers as the People's Crusade. Hardship found them almost immediately. Food ran short within weeks. Discipline collapsed entirely. Tensions with local populations along the route boiled over more than once. And in one of the darkest episodes tied to this whole early movement, some of these bands turned their violence against Jewish communities along the Rhine, committing massacres that stand among the grimmest chapters connected to the First Crusade. Several bishops tried to shelter Jewish families from the mobs, and some succeeded, but thousands were killed regardless. The violence exposed an uncomfortable truth about the whole crusading impulse from its earliest days. Religious passion, once mixed with fear, rumor, and existing prejudice, could turn savagely against people who had nothing to do with the stated cause at all. When Peter's ragged column finally reached Asia Minor, it collided with the disciplined professional forces of the Seljuk Turks, and the result was a disaster. In 1096, most of this force was destroyed near Civitot. The crusade proper had barely begun, and already thousands lay dead. While the People's Crusade ended in tragedy, the true expedition was only just gathering itself. Unlike Peter's followers, the main Crusader armies were commanded by some of the most experienced nobles in all of Europe. Among them stood Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest lords in all of southern France, Bohemond of Taranto, a formidable Norman commander out of southern Italy, his ambitious nephew Tancred, and Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy. These men never formed a single unified army under one banner. Each commanded his own separate following, each pursued his own private interests, and no supreme military commander stood over the whole enterprise. Urban himself never joined the expedition in person. Instead, the crusade amounted to several independent forces marching together under a shared religious purpose, a lack of centralized leadership that would create both opportunity and serious conflict down the road. By late 1096, these great armies began arriving outside Constantinople, and for most of these Western Europeans, the Byzantine capital seemed almost impossible to believe. Its population dwarfed anything they'd ever seen back home. Massive walls enclosed glittering palaces and magnificent churches, and its markets overflowed with goods pulled in from Africa, Asia, and every corner of Europe. Crusaders had expected to be welcomed as grateful allies. Byzantines greeted them far more cautiously. Emperor Alexios welcomed the Western forces while privately worrying about their sheer size and their unpredictability. He had asked for disciplined mercenaries and received, instead, tens of thousands of heavily armed foreigners, each one loyal first and foremost to his own lord, rather than to any shared command. Alexios required the Crusader leaders to swear formal oaths promising that any former Byzantine territory they recaptured along the way would be returned to the empire. Some swore willingly, others agreed only with visible reluctance, and some almost certainly never intended to honor the promise at all. The seeds of a much later conflict had already been planted before the campaign even truly started. In the spring of 1097, the Crusader armies crossed the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. Ahead of them lay nearly 2,000 miles of unfamiliar, often hostile territory, mountains, deserts, fortified cities, and powerful enemies. Few of them could imagine the hardship still to come. Fewer still imagined that, against every reasonable expectation, they would one day stand before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The First Crusade had truly begun, and it would become one of the most remarkable military expeditions of the entire Middle Ages, though its greatest tests still lay well ahead. Their first target was Nicaea, a city that had once served as capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, and also the very city where, back in 325, Emperor Constantine had convened the First Council of Nicaea, one of the defining moments in early Christian history. Reclaiming it carried weight beyond the merely strategic. The siege opened in May of 1097. Crusaders quickly discovered a serious problem, since Nicaea's western walls bordered a large lake, and as long as Turkish boats could cross that water freely, the defenders kept receiving fresh supplies no matter how tightly the land approaches were sealed off. Recognizing the danger, Emperor Alexios ordered Byzantine ships hauled overland to the lake itself, an unexpected maneuver that cut off the city's last remaining supply route. Facing starvation, the Turkish defenders finally surrendered, though not to the Crusaders directly. Instead, they negotiated quietly and privately with the Byzantine emperor, and Byzantine troops slipped into the city before the Crusaders could launch their planned final assault. The imperial banner replaced the Turkish standard overnight. Crusaders were furious. Many had expected to sack the city and claim the plunder traditionally awarded to victorious soldiers, and instead they were denied both loot and glory in one stroke. The victory secured Byzantine interests neatly enough, but it also deepened the mutual mistrust already growing between East and West. Marching deeper into Asia Minor after Nicaea, the Crusaders found the landscape itself becoming an enemy nearly as dangerous as any army. Summer heat scorched the open plains. Water grew desperately scarce. Food supplies dwindled with every mile, and the army stretched thin across miles of difficult terrain. Heavy armor that had served European knights so well back home turned exhausting under the relentless Anatolian sun, and many horses simply died along the way. Without mounts, heavily armored knights lost much of the battlefield advantage that had defined their entire style of warfare. Disease spread steadily through the crowded camps. Still, the army pushed forward, believing every mile brought them closer to their goal. On the 1st of July 1097, the Crusaders faced their first genuine test near Dorylaeum, where Seljuk forces, under Sultan Kilij Arslan, launched a sudden surprise attack. Turkish warfare looked nothing like anything these European knights had trained for. Rather than charging directly into contact, Turkish horse archers stayed highly mobile, sweeping across the battlefield to loose volleys of arrows before wheeling away out of reach, then attacking again and again in the same pattern. For hours, the vanguard under Bohemund of Taranto fought desperately just to hold its ground, and the camp itself descended into chaos as women and other non-combatants huddled inside makeshift defensive rings, formed from wagons and baggage, while arrows rained down without mercy. Just as the position seemed on the verge of collapse, reinforcements finally arrived. The rest of the Crusader force reached the field and struck from multiple directions at once. Unable to maintain their encirclement any longer, the Seljuks withdrew. Crusaders had survived, and the victory boosted morale considerably. But it also taught an important lesson. European methods of warfare alone weren't going to guarantee success on this campaign. Adaptation would be required. After Dorylaeum, the army continued pressing south through Anatolia, and progress slowed to a painful crawl. Food grew steadily harder to find. Years of ongoing warfare had already stripped many regions bare, and local harvests simply couldn't support armies this large passing through. Starvation became a near-constant companion. Contemporary chroniclers describe soldiers eating roots, wild plants, and even scraps of leather stripped from their own equipment. Countless horses died from hunger alone, and without enough pack animals left, moving supplies grew even harder. Disease tore through the weakened camps. Faith, the Crusaders were discovering firsthand, could not fill an empty stomach. By October of 1097, the surviving army reached one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean, Antioch. Its massive walls stretched for nearly 8 miles, studded with hundreds of defensive towers, and its natural defenses made any direct assault nearly unthinkable. Crusaders simply lacked enough men to completely encircle a city this size, which meant defenders kept receiving occasional supplies throughout what became one of the longest and most desperate sieges of the entire crusade, stretching on for close to 8 months. Winter brought freezing rain and bitter cold. Food nearly vanished entirely. Writers of the period describe horses slaughtered for meat, and some accounts even suggest that in the most desperate pockets of starvation, isolated instances of cannibalism occurred, claims that remain genuinely debated among historians, but that appear in several period chronicles regardless. Desertion climbed steadily, and even respected leaders abandoned the effort, Stephen of Blois among them, convinced the whole expedition was doomed. Yet many stayed, not because victory looked likely, but because they believed God had called them to see the thing through regardless. In June of 1098, after months of suffering, the Crusaders finally caught a break. A guard inside Antioch agreed to betray the city. Under cover of darkness, a small group scaled the walls and opened one of the gates from within. Crusaders poured through the breach, street fighting erupted across the city, and after months of starvation and despair, Antioch finally fell into their hands. That triumph lasted only days. A massive Muslim relief force under Kerboga, ruler of Mosul, arrived almost immediately and surrounded the city in turn, and suddenly the Crusaders found themselves the ones besieged inside their own hard-won conquest. Food disappeared once more. Morale collapsed. Many believed the entire expedition had finally reached its true end. During this second siege, an obscure provincial monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions from St. Andrew, insisting that the very spear believed to have pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion lay buried beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter, right there inside Antioch. Plenty of people doubted him openly. Excavations began anyway, and after hours of digging, Peter produced an iron spearhead from the ground. Whether it genuinely was the relic he claimed remains impossible to know, and even many contemporaries questioned its authenticity at the time. But for an exhausted, starving army teetering on collapse, its discovery turned despair into something resembling hope almost overnight. They took it as a sign from God, and their confidence returned. On the 28th of June 1598, the Crusaders marched out to meet Kerboga's far larger army directly, and against overwhelming odds they won a remarkable victory. The Muslim coalition broke apart, Kerboga retreated, and the road toward Jerusalem stood open once more. By early 1099, the surviving Crusaders resumed their long march south. Of the tens of thousands who had originally left Europe, only a fraction now remained. They had crossed mountains, survived starvation, endured disease, captured mighty walled cities, and defeated powerful armies along the way. And yet their single greatest challenge still waited ahead. Beyond the hills of Judea stood the city they had dreamed of for nearly 3 years, Jerusalem. Its walls rose above the surrounding countryside, and for many of these worn, weathered survivors, the first sight of the holy city brought them to tears. Some dropped to their knees on the spot. Others simply prayed where they stood. The long journey was almost finished, but the fight for the city itself had not yet begun. Contrary to a common misconception, Jerusalem was no longer even held by the Seljuk Turks by this point. Only the previous year, in 1098, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had retaken the city from Seljuk control. The Fatimids, followers of Ismaili Shia Islam, now governed Jerusalem and much of southern Palestine, and the city's governor understood full well that the Crusaders were approaching. He prepared carefully, stockpiling food, reinforcing the walls, and poisoning or destroying wells outside the city to deny the invaders water. Christian residents inside the city were expelled outright, partly out of fear they might aid the approaching army from within. Jerusalem's defenders braced themselves for one of the largest sieges the city had ever endured. Crusaders arriving outside the walls were exhausted, their numbers reduced dramatically by years of hard campaigning. Modern estimates suggest something like 12 to 15,000 soldiers remained, including perhaps 12 to 1,500 knights, many of them weak from hunger. Summer heat in Palestine proved unlike anything most of these Europeans had ever experienced, and water sat desperately scarce, the nearby springs barely able to sustain the army at all. Men and animals alike suffered terribly under a relentless sun, Worse still, the Crusaders quickly realized they had no siege equipment whatsoever. Jerusalem's walls were far too strong for any direct assault, and without towers, ladders, and battering rams, the city would remain essentially unconquerable. Time was running out fast, every day consuming precious supplies the army could not easily replace. Help arrived unexpectedly by sea, when a small fleet of Genoese sailors reached the nearby port of Jaffa, carrying supplies and skilled craftsmen. The ships themselves couldn't sail all the way to Jerusalem, so their timber was dismantled and hauled inland instead, supplemented by wood cut from nearby forests despite how scarce suitable trees actually were in the region. Working day and night, carpenters built massive siege towers, scaling ladders, and battering rams. The labor pulled the whole army together. Knights, craftsmen, monks, and ordinary soldiers all working side by side, every beam raised bringing them one step closer to the walls. Defenders watched from above the whole time, launching arrows, stones, and fire down at the workers whenever the chance arose. A race had quietly begun. Could the Crusaders finish their machines before hunger forced them to abandon the entire siege? As the effort dragged on, Crusader leaders began seeking divine favor alongside military preparation. Following biblical precedent, they organized a solemn religious procession. On the 8th of July, 1099, the entire army marched barefoot in a circuit around Jerusalem's walls. Priests carried relics, bishops led prayers aloud, psalms echoed across the surrounding hills as the procession deliberately recalled the biblical story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. Many Crusaders genuinely believed that just as God had once delivered Jericho into Israelite hands, he would now deliver Jerusalem into theirs. Whatever the defenders made of the spectacle from atop the walls, for the Crusaders themselves it strengthened morale considerably. The siege had become something more than a purely military campaign. It had become a sacred act in their own eyes. Before dawn on the 14th of July, Crusaders moved their siege towers into position, a remarkable feat of coordination in itself. Under cover of darkness, engineers dismantled and relocated the largest tower to a less heavily defended stretch of the northern wall. By sunrise, defenders realized the main assault had shifted location entirely, and fighting erupted along the whole perimeter at once. Archers traded volleys, stones crashed down from catapults, ladders splintered under the weight of defenders pushing them back. Boiling liquids and burning material rained down on the attackers below. For nearly 2 full days, neither side gained a decisive edge. Then, on the morning of July 15th, everything changed at once. Near the northeastern corner of the city, the siege tower commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon finally reached the walls. A drawbridge dropped into place. Crusader knights surged across it, one by one establishing a foothold atop the battlements, and the defenders soon began falling back in earnest. Gates opened from within. The Crusader army poured into Jerusalem. After nearly 3 years of marching, the First Crusade had finally achieved the objective that had started it all. What followed remains one of the most difficult and controversial episodes in the entire history of the Crusades. As was tragically common after successful medieval sieges anywhere in the world, many inhabitants of Jerusalem lost their lives in the hours and days that followed. Latin chroniclers writing at the time often framed the victory as divine judgment made visible, sometimes describing the scale of violence in vivid, celebratory language. Muslim chroniclers, writing from the perspective of the defeated, emphasized instead the scale of the slaughter and the suffering inflicted on the city's residents. Modern historians broadly agree that significant numbers of Muslim defenders and civilians were killed once the city fell, and Jewish residents who had sought shelter inside their synagogue also perished, either in the fighting itself or in fires that followed. The precise death toll remains genuinely uncertain, and some of the more dramatic figures found in later sources are almost certainly exaggerated well beyond what actually occurred. Not everyone in the city died that day. Some inhabitants were ransomed, others managed to escape, and still others were taken captive rather than killed outright. The full historical record is genuinely complicated. What isn't in dispute is that the conquest left deep, lasting wounds in the collective memory of Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, wounds that would shape relations between these communities for centuries afterward. Once the fighting finally ended, Many crusaders made their way straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. According to several eyewitness accounts, warriors who had spent years marching and fighting removed their armor there and simply prayed. For them, this expedition had always meant more than conquest alone. It had been, from the very beginning, an act of devotion, and many genuinely believed they had fulfilled the vow they made back at Clermont. Whether viewed through the lens of faith or through the lens of history, the moment stood as something extraordinary. An expedition many had believed flatly impossible had reached its destination against every reasonable expectation. Victory raised an immediate new question. Who would actually rule Jerusalem now? Some expected a king to be crowned on the spot. Instead, Godfrey of Bouillon turned down the royal title altogether. According to later tradition, he declared that he would not wear a crown of gold in the same city where Christ had once worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead the more modest title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Historians still debate the exact wording of that tradition, but Godfrey genuinely did refuse coronation as king. After his death the following year, his brother Baldwin I accepted the royal title in his place, becoming the first true king of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was born alongside the county of Edessa, the county of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch, together forming a network of Crusader states that would endure, in one form or another, for nearly 2 centuries. Their survival, though, was never guaranteed. Surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbours and dependent on a steady flow of support from Europe, these fragile little kingdoms faced an uncertain future from the very start. The First Crusade had ended in astonishing, improbable success. In many ways, though, a far longer and harder struggle was only just beginning. For nearly 90 years after Jerusalem's capture, the Crusader states somehow endured. Against most reasonable expectations, a scattering of Latin Christian kingdoms held on along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Kingdom of Jerusalem grew into the jewel of this entire Crusader world. European pilgrims once again walked its streets freely. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa filled its ports. New castles rose across the hills of Palestine, and powerful military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller among them, guarded the roads, defended the fortresses, and grew into some of the most formidable fighting forces anywhere in the medieval world. To many watching from Europe, it seemed the First Crusade had permanently tilted the balance of power in Christendom's favour. Beneath the surface, though, these states remained fragile. They were small, they were often divided against one another, and they depended heavily on reinforcements arriving from across the sea. Their Muslim neighbours, meanwhile, were slowly beginning to unite behind a genuinely remarkable leader, a man whose name would become legendary on both sides of the conflict, Saladin. Born around 1137, into a Kurdish family serving the Muslim ruler Nur al-Din, Saladin, known in Arabic as Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, didn't rise to power through any single dramatic victory. His success came instead through patience, diplomacy, and considerable political skill. Starting out as a military officer, he was sent to Egypt during a struggle between competing Muslim dynasties, and within just a few years had risen to become vizier of Egypt. After Nur al-Din's death in 1174, Saladin gradually brought Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and parts of Arabia together under his own leadership. For decades, Muslim rulers had often fought one another nearly as fiercely as they fought the Crusaders, and Saladin worked deliberately to change that pattern. He presented resistance to the Crusader states not merely as a political campaign, but as a religious duty, and by unifying much of the Muslim world under one banner, he accomplished exactly what the Crusader kingdoms had long feared most, transforming scattered, disorganized resistance into coordinated strength. Relations between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's growing empire weren't defined purely by warfare. Periods of open conflict alternated with genuine negotiation. Trade continued through much of it. Prisoners were exchanged. Diplomatic envoys crossed the frontier regularly, and not every knight sought battle, nor did every Muslim ruler seek conquest. Peace, though, depended entirely on trust, and trust proved increasingly difficult to sustain. Among the most controversial of the Crusader lords was Reynald of Châtillon, known for his boldness and, according to many accounts from the period, his outright recklessness. Reynold repeatedly broke agreed truces by attacking Muslim caravans passing through territory under Saladin's protection. One raid reportedly seized a caravan carrying relatives of the Sultan himself. Another threatened routes leading toward the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Whether driven by greed, ambition, or simple hostility, Reynold's actions pushed a fragile peace steadily toward collapse, and for Saladin, these provocations could not be allowed to stand unanswered. In the summer of 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced its greatest test yet. Saladin assembled one of the largest Muslim armies the Crusader states had ever encountered, and his strategy proved as brilliant as it was simple. Rather than attacking Jerusalem directly, he threatened the city of Tiberias instead, forcing Crusader leadership into a difficult choice about whether to march their army across brutal, arid countryside to relieve it. King Guy of Lusignan chose to advance, and the decision proved disastrous. As the Crusader army pushed through the scorching July heat, Saladin's forces harassed them relentlessly the entire way. Mounted archers struck from a distance. Water sources were deliberately cut off. Smoke from deliberately set fires drifted across the battlefield, adding confusion and exhaustion on top of thirst and heat. By the 4th of July, the Crusaders had reached the volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin, and there, surrounded and utterly exhausted, they made their final stand. The battle ended in catastrophe. Most of the Crusader army was destroyed outright. The True Cross, one of Christianity's most revered relics, was captured on the field. Many leading nobles were taken prisoner. Reynold of Chatillon was executed by Saladin's own hand after refusing the terms offered him, while King Guy was spared and treated according to the ordinary customs of medieval warfare. Defeat at Hattin shattered the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a single afternoon. With its army destroyed, cities across the kingdom began surrendering one after another. Castles and towns opened their gates in quick succession, until only Jerusalem itself remained standing. Defense of the city fell to Balian of Ibelin, a respected noble who suddenly found himself responsible for protecting thousands of civilians with barely a handful of knights left to command. He knew full well the city couldn't withstand a prolonged siege, yet surrendering without negotiation was equally unthinkable to him. In September of 1187, Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem, and after several days of fighting, Balian requested terms. Unlike the city's brutal capture back in 1099, this time Jerusalem changed hands through negotiated agreement rather than storm. Saladin allowed many residents to ransom themselves and leave peacefully, and those unable to pay often relied on wealthier neighbors or Muslim officials willing to help cover the cost of their release. Not everyone escaped hardship or captivity entirely, but the conquest proved markedly less destructive than the city's fall had been nearly 90 years before. On the 2nd of October 1187, Jerusalem passed once again into Muslim hands, and the Christian kingdom had lost the very city that had inspired the entire crusading movement in the first place. News of the loss spread rapidly across Europe, met everywhere with genuine shock. Pope Gregory VIII called immediately for a new crusade, and this time Europe's greatest rulers answered the summons personally. 3 kings prepared to march east together: Richard I of England, remembered ever since as Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Never before had such powerful monarchs joined a crusading effort all at once, and expectations across Europe soared, with many believing Jerusalem would soon be reclaimed for good. Yet tragedy struck before the armies even reached the Holy Land. While crossing a river in Anatolia in 1190, the 70-year-old emperor Frederick Barbarossa drowned, and his death devastated the German contingent, much of which simply turned back afterward. The expedition lost one of its most experienced commanders before it had even reached its destination. Of every leader involved in this Third Crusade, none became more famous than Richard of England. A brilliant battlefield commander, Richard quickly earned genuine admiration from allies and enemies alike. After capturing the important port city of Acre in 1191, he marched south along the Mediterranean coast, and at the Battle of Arsuf achieved one of the Crusaders' greatest victories of the entire campaign. His disciplined infantry, holding firm against repeated Muslim attacks until his knights launched a devastating counterattack that broke Saladin's assault. Saladin's army withdrew, and Crusader confidence surged. Yet despite Richard's clear military success, Jerusalem itself remained just out of reach. Twice he advanced toward the Holy City, twice he turned back. His own advisors warned that even if Jerusalem could be captured, it couldn't realistically be defended afterward against Saladin's larger remaining forces. Richard confronted a painful truth. Taking a city and holding it were very different problems entirely. Richard and Saladin never actually met face to face, but medieval chroniclers turned their rivalry into legend all the same. Christian writers came to admire Saladin's courage, generosity, and chivalry, while Muslim chroniclers respected Richard's undeniable military brilliance in return. Modern historians recognize that many of these legendary accounts exaggerate the mutual admiration involved, yet they still reflect something genuinely true underneath the exaggeration, that both men understood they faced an opponent genuinely worth respecting. By 1192, both armies were thoroughly exhausted, years of hard campaigning having drained men and resources on both sides. Neither side possessed the strength left to force a complete victory. Richard wanted to return home to Europe. Saladin wanted stability after years of relentless warfare. The result was the Treaty of Jaffa, which allowed the Crusaders to retain a narrow coastal strip stretching from Tyre down to Jaffa, while Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim control, with Christian pilgrims guaranteed permission to visit its holy sites. Neither side achieved everything it wanted, but neither suffered total defeat either. From a purely military standpoint, Richard had preserved what remained of the Crusader territories. From a religious standpoint, though, the Crusade had failed to reach its central goal. Jerusalem stayed beyond Christian control, and the dream that had first inspired thousands back at Clermont remained unfulfilled. Still, the struggle was far from finished. More crusades would follow, more armies would march east, more kings would chase after the Holy City. But after Saladin's victories, the whole balance of power had shifted permanently. The Crusader states were no longer expanding outward. They were fighting simply to survive, and the era of easy victories had come to a definitive close. In 1198, a new pope ascended to the throne of St. Peter. Pope Innocent III ranked among the most ambitious and influential leaders in medieval history, and he believed deeply in the universal mission of the papacy. Almost immediately after his election, he called for yet another crusade aimed once more at Jerusalem, though this time the underlying strategy would look very different. Rather than marching overland through Anatolia, a route that had proven costly and dangerous on every previous attempt, the Crusaders would instead sail directly to attack Egypt by sea. Egypt at the time served as the economic and political center of Muslim power across the eastern Mediterranean, and many believed that if Egypt fell, Jerusalem would eventually follow through negotiation or continued pressure. The plan was bold, but it hinged on one absolutely crucial requirement: ships, thousands of them. No single European kingdom possessed enough vessels to transport an entire army across the Mediterranean on its own. Only one power held the necessary fleet: the Republic of Venice. Under the leadership of its elderly but remarkably energetic Doge, Enrico Dandolo, Venice agreed to build and supply hundreds of transport ships for the expedition, at an enormous price, roughly 85,000 silver marks, one of the largest financial agreements struck anywhere in the Middle Ages. But when Crusaders finally assembled in Venice in 1202, disaster struck immediately. Far fewer soldiers had actually shown up than expected, and worse still, they lacked the money to pay the agreed sum in full. The crusade was effectively bankrupt before it had even properly begun. Venice now faced a genuinely difficult choice of its own. Its enormous fleet had been constructed at tremendous expense, and the Republic wanted compensation one way or another. Doge Dandolo proposed an alternative arrangement. Instead of immediate payment in full, the Crusaders could help Venice capture the Adriatic port city of Zara. There was, unfortunately, one glaring problem with that plan. Zara wasn't a Muslim city at all. It was a Christian city, and it belonged, moreover, to the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the Crusader vow. Some Crusaders flatly refused to take part. Others argued, quite reasonably, that attacking fellow Christians defeated the entire stated purpose of the crusade. Pope Innocent expressly forbade the assault outright. Economic necessity and Venetian pressure won out regardless. In November 1202, the Crusaders besieged and took Zara, and Pope Innocent responded by excommunicating both the Venetians and the Crusaders directly involved in the attack. Although many of the Crusaders were later absolved after expressing genuine repentance and agreeing to continue the expedition, the Fourth Crusade had barely started, and already it had struck Christians instead of Muslims. An even greater detour still lay ahead. While the Crusaders wintered following Zara's capture, an unexpected visitor arrived in their camp, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. Alexios made an extraordinary proposal. If the Crusaders would help restore his father to the Byzantine throne, he promised remarkable rewards in return: a vast payment in silver, military support for the wider crusade, fresh supplies and soldiers, and even submission of the Byzantine Church to the authority of Rome. For Crusader leaders drowning in debt and uncertain how they'd even reach Egypt at this point, the proposal proved nearly irresistible. Many genuinely believed that a reunited Christian world would strengthen future campaigns against Muslim powers considerably. Others simply saw a straightforward chance to finally finance the expedition properly. The crusade changed course entirely. Jerusalem would have to wait. The fleet turned instead toward Constantinople. To medieval Europeans, Constantinople was unlike any city they had ever laid eyes on. Its enormous walls stretched for miles. Its population may have exceeded 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities anywhere in the world, and its skyline was dominated by the magnificent Hagia Sophia, its immense dome seeming almost to float above the rooftops. Markets overflowed with silk from China, spices from India, and precious goods gathered from every corner of the known world. Many Western Crusaders had never imagined wealth on this scale. Some saw the glorious capital of Christianity itself. Others saw riches beyond anything they had ever encountered, and both impressions would shape everything that happened next. In 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before Constantinople's walls, and after intense fighting, breached parts of the city's defences. The reigning emperor fled the city outright, and Isaac II was restored to the throne alongside his son, now crowned Alexios IV. For a brief moment, the Crusaders believed their mission had genuinely succeeded. But Alexios soon ran into an impossible problem of his own making. He simply couldn't fulfill the enormous financial promises he had made to secure Crusader support. The imperial treasury sat nearly empty. New taxes were imposed to raise funds. Sacred treasures were melted down for silver. Public anger exploded across the city, and Constantinople's own residents increasingly came to view the Crusaders not as liberators, but as dangerous occupiers camped at their gates. Violence broke out between the city's inhabitants and the Western forces, and the fragile alliance collapsed entirely. In early 1204, Alexios IV was overthrown and killed during a palace revolution, and the new emperor who replaced him refused to honor any of the previous agreements at all. Crusaders now faced a stark choice: return home in complete failure, or take the city by force. On the 9th of April 1204, the Crusaders launched their assault. The first attempt failed outright. 3 days later they tried again, and this time broke through the city's defences for good. What followed stunned the entire medieval world. For 3 straight days, Constantinople was subjected to widespread systematic looting. Churches were stripped of their treasures, monasteries were plundered top to bottom, libraries suffered serious damage. Homes and palaces across the city were ransacked, and relics collected over centuries of Byzantine history were carried off wholesale to Western Europe. Even the magnificent Hagia Sophia itself was entered and looted by the conquering soldiers. A Byzantine chronicler who witnessed the fall firsthand described scenes of destruction and sacrilege with genuine, deep sorrow, and even some Western writers of the period expressed real unease at the sheer scale of the devastation they had helped unleash. The wealthiest city in all of Christendom had been conquered not by Muslims, not by pagans, but by fellow Christians carrying crosses of their own. Following this conquest, the Crusaders established what became known as the Latin Empire of Constantinople. A Western emperor replaced the Byzantine ruler outright. A Latin patriarch replaced the Orthodox patriarch in turn. Large portions of former Byzantine territory were carved up and divided among Crusader nobles and Venetian merchants alike. For Venice, the entire expedition proved enormously profitable in the end, securing valuable ports, islands, and trading privileges scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. For the Byzantine world, though, the consequences were nothing short of catastrophic. Although Byzantine successor states eventually managed to recapture Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully recovered its former strength afterward. Many historians consider the Fourth Crusade one of the key events that fatally weakened Byzantium well before its eventual conquest by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Fourth Crusade permanently transformed the relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism. Old theological disputes from previous centuries certainly remained important, but after 1204, something even deeper divided the two traditions, and that something was memory itself. Orthodox Christians remembered the destruction of their capital at the hands of fellow Christians. Catholics, for their part, often remembered the whole crusade as a tragic, unfortunate diversion from its original purpose. The sack of Constantinople became a lasting symbol of betrayal on both sides. Nearly 800 years later, in 2001, Pope John Paul II publicly expressed sorrow for the suffering inflicted during the Fourth Crusade. Orthodox leaders welcomed that gesture warmly, but history, of course, cannot simply be undone. The events of 1204 left scars still visible today. The Crusades had begun with a stated promise to unite Christianity. Instead, this particular chapter helped deepen one of Christianity's oldest and most painful divisions even further. The road to Jerusalem had led, quite unexpectedly, to Constantinople instead, and there, within the walls of the greatest Christian city of the entire Middle Ages, the dream of a united Christendom suffered one of its most devastating defeats. By the early 13th century, the age of great Crusader victories had already passed. Jerusalem was gone. Constantinople had fallen, though to Crusaders rather than to any Muslim army. The Christian kingdoms established after the First Crusade still clung stubbornly to the Mediterranean coastline, but they stood isolated, vulnerable, and increasingly dependent on whatever help Europe cared to send. Yet the dream that had first inspired Urban at Clermont refused to simply fade away. Popes kept calling for new crusades, and kings kept answering. Knights kept taking the cross. Thousands more set out for the Holy Land, though each new expedition revealed a world that had already changed. The balance of power had shifted for good. The Crusades were no longer expanding Christendom outward. They were now struggling simply to preserve what little remained. Few episodes from this later crusading period carry more legend attached to them than the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. For centuries, popular stories claimed that tens of thousands of children marched toward the Mediterranean, believing that God would part the sea before them and lead them safely all the way to Jerusalem. Many versions of the tale ended in tragedy, with children supposedly sold into slavery or dying somewhere along the road. Modern historians paint a considerably more complicated picture. The movement appears to have included not only actual children, but also poor peasants, adolescents, wandering laborers, and ordinary religious pilgrims, and the Latin word, often translated simply as children, may have referred more broadly to impoverished young people or landless followers of no fixed home. What remains clear is that thousands of people were genuinely inspired by charismatic preachers active in Germany and France at the time, driven by sincere faith and the belief that innocence itself might succeed where trained armies had already failed. No miracle occurred. Most never reached the Holy Land at all. Many simply turned around and went home, while others vanished into the general uncertainty of medieval travel. Whether understood as history, legend, or some blend of both, the episode became a powerful symbol of just how far the crusading movement's religious enthusiasm had spread by this point, reaching even the youngest and most vulnerable members of society. In 1217, another major expedition set out for the east. Leaders of this Fifth Crusade believed they had learned real lessons from earlier failures, and this time, rather than attacking Jerusalem directly, they targeted Egypt instead. recognizing it once again as the strategic center of Muslim power. If Cairo could be seriously threatened, the thinking went, Jerusalem might follow through negotiation or continued military pressure. Crusaders achieved genuine early success, capturing the important port city of Damietta in 1219. Disagreements among the Crusader leadership soon undermined the whole campaign, though. Some wanted to negotiate a settlement, others demanded nothing short of total victory. When the army finally advanced toward Cairo itself, disaster followed close behind. The annual flooding of the Nile trapped the Crusader force in place, and surrounded and cut off from any fresh supplies, they were eventually forced to surrender outright. Damietta was handed back. The crusade ended in failure. The next major crusade unfolded quite unlike any that had come before it, led by Emperor Frederick II, one of the most remarkable and genuinely controversial rulers of the entire Middle Ages. Frederick spoke several languages fluently and had studied science, philosophy, mathematics, and Islamic culture in real depth. His relationship with the papacy stayed deeply strained throughout his life, and after repeatedly delaying his own promised crusade, Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him outright. Frederick sailed east anyway. Rather than leaning primarily on military conquest, he pursued diplomacy instead. In 1229, he negotiated directly with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, a nephew of Saladin himself, and the resulting agreement astonished the medieval world. Without fighting a single major battle, Frederick secured Christian control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth through negotiation alone, and crowned himself King of Jerusalem inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The peace, though, remained fragile from the start. Many church leaders distrusted Frederick deeply because of his ongoing conflict with the Pope, and many Muslims viewed the treaty as merely temporary from the outset. Within 15 years, Jerusalem was lost once again. Frederick had proven that diplomacy could occasionally accomplish what armies simply couldn't, but diplomacy, in the end, proved just as temporary as any battlefield victory. The final great royal crusades were led by King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. Few medieval rulers were ever more personally devoted to the crusading ideal than he was. His first expedition, beginning in 1248, targeted Egypt once again. Crusaders captured Damietta once more, advanced inland once more, and disaster followed once more. At the Battle of Al-Mansura, Louis's army suffered devastating losses, and the king himself was taken captive. Only after paying an enormous ransom was he finally released. Remarkably, Louis refused to simply abandon the crusading cause afterward. He remained in the Holy Land for several more years, strengthening fortifications and improving the defences of what remained of the Crusader territories. In 1270, he launched yet another crusade, this time targeting Tunis in North Africa, but disease struck the army almost immediately upon arrival, and Louis died before the campaign accomplished anything at all. His death symbolized the fading of an entire age, the age of the crusading kings drawing quietly to a close. As European enthusiasm for crusading gradually declined, a powerful new force emerged across the Middle East, the Mamluks. Originally elite military slaves serving Muslim rulers in Egypt, the Mamluks eventually seized power for themselves under leaders like Sultan Baybars, transforming Egypt into the dominant military power of the entire eastern Mediterranean. Baybars proved a relentless opponent of what remained of the Crusader states. One by one, castles that had stood for generations fell before advancing Mamluk armies. The great fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, long regarded as nearly impregnable by anyone who saw it, surrendered in 1271. Other strongholds soon followed suit. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land shrank steadily with every passing year, and the entire era of expansion was well and truly over. The remaining Christian territories now fought simply to survive. The final chapter arrived in 1291. By then, only a handful of Crusader cities remained standing at all, the most important being Acre, which for nearly a century had served as capital of the surviving Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its harbour connected Europe with the Holy Land, its markets bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, and its walls represented the very last major stronghold of Latin Christianity anywhere in the East. When Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil assembled a massive Mamluk army outside the city, its defenders understood full well they faced overwhelming odds. The siege dragged on for several weeks. Catapults battered the walls relentlessly. Mining operations undermined key towers from below. Wave after wave of assault gradually wore down the city's defences, and though the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and other defenders fought with genuinely extraordinary determination, sheer numbers and resources favoured the attackers throughout. On the 18th of May, 1291, Acre finally fell. Many defenders died fighting to the last. Others managed to flee by sea. Surviving Crusader fortresses along the coast were soon abandoned or captured outright, and after nearly 2 full centuries, the Crusader states had ceased to exist entirely. Historians have debated the reasons behind the eventual collapse of these Crusader kingdoms for generations now, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. Several factors combined together instead. The Crusader states remained permanently isolated geographically, relying heavily on reinforcements that had to cross an entire sea to reach them. Political rivalries repeatedly divided their own leadership from within. Muslim powers, meanwhile, had gradually grown far more unified under figures like Saladin and later the Mamluk sultans. European priorities shifted too, as kings increasingly focused their attention and resources on conflicts closer to home. Wars between England and France alone consumed enormous energy that might once have gone east instead. The raw enthusiasm that had once inspired the First Crusade slowly faded with each passing generation. The age of crusading hadn't ended overnight by any means, but by the close of the 13th century, its greatest ambitions had clearly faded for good. The fall of Acre marked far more than the loss of a single city. It marked, in every meaningful sense, the end of a dream nearly 2 centuries in the making. Nearly 200 years earlier, thousands had crossed entire continents, believing they could permanently reclaim the Holy Land for good. And for a time, remarkably, they had succeeded. They had built genuine kingdoms, raised castles that still stand as ruins today, founded churches, and created new societies where Europe and the Middle East met and mixed in ways that hadn't existed before. History, though, rarely holds still for long. Empires rise and empires fall, and the Crusader states became one more turn of that same ancient cycle. Yet although the kingdoms themselves eventually disappeared, the Crusades as a historical force didn't simply end with them. Their memory would go on shaping relations between Christians and Muslims for generations, and their legacy would influence politics, trade, culture, and religion across the centuries that followed. The armies had marched home, the castles had fallen, but the story of the Crusades was far from finished. Its greatest impact was, in many ways, only beginning to be understood. Why did the Crusades actually happen in the first place? It remains one of the most debated questions in all of medieval history. For a long time, the answer seemed straightforward enough. The Crusades were fought to reclaim Jerusalem, to defend Christianity, to serve God. Modern historians, though, have painted a considerably more complex picture over time. The Crusades weren't driven by any single cause. They emerged from a genuinely powerful combination of religious conviction, political ambition, economic opportunity, personal honor, and pure historical circumstance colliding all at once. Some Crusaders sincerely believed they were undertaking the greatest pilgrimage of their entire lives. Others saw real opportunities for prestige, influence, or simple survival. Many were moved by several of these motives simultaneously, layered on top of one another. The Crusades were never purely about faith, and they were never merely wars for wealth either. They were born, instead, from the exact point where belief and power intersected. To really understand the Crusades, we have to first understand the medieval Christian mind that produced them. For people living through the 11th and 12th centuries, religion wasn't separate from ordinary daily life in the way it often is today. It shaped every single decision: birth, marriage, work, war, death, all of it existing inside a deeply religious worldview that touched everything. Most Europeans of the period believed history itself unfolded according to God's own plan, and the Holy Land wasn't simply another region on a map somewhere. It was the actual place where Christ had lived, preached, died, and, they believed, risen from the dead. the spiritual center of the entire Christian story. Visiting it was considered one of the greatest possible acts of devotion a believer could undertake. So when Urban described the crusade as both an armed pilgrimage and an act of penance, his words resonated with a depth modern audiences can find genuinely hard to fully grasp. Many people today wonder why so many were willing to abandon comfortable lives for an uncertain, years-long expedition into the unknown. The answer lies largely in sincere belief. Many crusaders truly expected spiritual reward in return for their sacrifice, believing that serving this cause would bring them meaningfully closer to salvation. Surviving letters and wills from the period reveal that many participants carefully arranged their affairs before setting out, fully expecting they might never return home at all. They weren't preparing for adventure, they were preparing for death. One of the strongest arguments against the popular notion that crusaders were primarily driven by simple greed comes down to plain financial reality. Joining a crusade was extraordinarily expensive by any measure. A knight had to purchase horses, armor, weapons, food, and servants, and fund years of travel on top of all that. Modern estimates suggest that taking part in the First Crusade often cost several times a knight's entire annual income. Many nobles mortgaged their estates outright to afford it. Others sold off land that had remained inside their families for generations. Some never recovered financially at all. Those who survived and returned often came home deep in debt, regardless of how the campaign had gone. Certainly a handful of crusaders did acquire real wealth along the way. Some gained land in the east, and Italian merchants in particular benefited enormously from the expanded trade routes that followed. But for the average participant, joining a crusade represented a genuine financial sacrifice rather than any kind of shrewd investment. None of this means material ambition was entirely absent from the movement. It simply means that ambition was rarely, on its own, the whole story. While ordinary crusaders were often driven primarily by personal faith, rulers tended to view the whole movement through a considerably broader political lens. For the papacy, the Crusades offered a genuine opportunity to strengthen leadership over the whole of Western Christendom. By calling the First Crusade himself, Urban demonstrated clearly that the Pope, and not any individual king or emperor, could unite Europe behind a single common cause. Success would enhance both spiritual and political authority at once. Kings and princes carried their own separate interests into the movement too. Participation in a crusade could raise a ruler's prestige considerably. Victory might strengthen an entire dynasty's standing. Military success on this scale could elevate a ruler's reputation across the whole continent. Byzantine emperors, for their part, had initially sought only practical military assistance rather than an entire international expedition of this size. Alexios Komnenos had simply hoped to recover lost provinces in Anatolia. Instead, he received armies whose ambitions frequently exceeded anything he had originally expected or wanted. Every major political leader involved, in other words, saw something genuinely different reflected in the crusading movement. The Pope sought spiritual leadership. The Emperor sought military aid. Kings pursued personal honor. Each of these goals overlapped with the others in places, but none of them were ever quite identical. Economic interests shaped the Crusades in important ways too, and few benefited more directly than the maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Their ships carried Crusader armies across the Mediterranean, and in return they received valuable commercial privileges, ports, and trading rights scattered throughout the eastern Mediterranean. New markets opened up as a result. Trade expanded dramatically over the following decades. European merchants gained direct access to goods that had once seemed impossibly exotic: silk, spices, sugar, cotton, fine glassware, and precious metals among them. The Crusades didn't exactly create international trade from nothing, since trade routes had existed for centuries already, but they did intensify and accelerate those existing connections considerably. Venice in particular transformed itself into one of Europe's greatest commercial powers, largely on the back of crusading logistics. The Fourth Crusade later demonstrated just how far economic interests alone could redirect an entire military campaign, since the conquest of Constantinople was driven as much by financial considerations as by any remaining religious ones. Medieval society also placed enormous value on personal honor. And for knights specifically, reputation mattered almost as much as outright victory did. The Crusades offered an opportunity unlike anything else available to them. Success in the Holy Land promised a kind of fame capable of lasting for generations after a man's death. Families proudly remembered ancestors who had taken the cross for years afterward. Coats of arms began incorporating symbols tied to crusading. Songs celebrated heroic deeds performed in the East, and chronicles carefully recorded acts of courage and sacrifice for posterity. Not every knight who joined sought wealth above all else. Many sought something less tangible instead: honor, glory, simply the chance to be remembered by future generations. In an age without newspapers, photography, or anything resembling modern media, reputation lived and traveled entirely through stories passed from person to person, and the Crusades produced stories that echoed across medieval Europe for centuries. For a long time, the Crusades were often described simply as a straightforward conflict between Christianity and Islam. Modern scholarship paints a considerably more nuanced picture than that. The Muslim world itself was deeply divided throughout this period, with Sunni and Shia dynasties competing fiercely for power, and regional rulers frequently fighting one another rather than any outside invader. Christian alliances, meanwhile, sometimes crossed religious boundaries entirely when it suited practical interests. Christian Europe, in turn, was far from unified either. Crusaders quarreled constantly among themselves throughout the entire period. Western armies fought Byzantine Christians on more than one occasion, and political alliances frequently mattered more in practice than shared religious identity ever did. The Crusades were certainly religious wars in a very real sense, but they were also political wars, dynastic wars, economic struggles, and complicated cultural encounters all at once. Reducing them to a simple clash between two opposing civilizations oversimplifies a far messier and more complicated historical reality. When the First Crusade began back in 1096, Western Europe was still emerging from centuries of political fragmentation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire long before. By the time the Crusading era finally wound down, Europe looked considerably different. The Crusades accelerated contact between East and West, on a scale unseen since antiquity itself. Pilgrims became travelers, in a much broader sense. Knights became explorers of a sort. Merchants established permanent commercial networks stretching across the Mediterranean that would long outlast the crusading movement itself. Ports like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa flourished as a direct result, and trade expanded dramatically throughout the period. European markets increasingly offered goods that had once seemed almost mythically exotic: silk from Asia, pepper from India, sugar from the Levant, fine glass from Syria, along with carpets, dyes, perfumes, and medicines drawn from across the wider Islamic world. The Crusades didn't invent international trade, but they undeniably expanded it, and alongside that trade came ideas as well. One of the most lasting consequences of the whole crusading period turned out to be intellectual rather than territorial. The Islamic world had preserved and considerably expanded much of the scientific knowledge originally inherited from ancient Greece, Persia, and India, knowledge that had been largely lost or forgotten in much of Western Europe during earlier centuries. Through increasing contact, both peaceful and violent, Europe gradually encountered real advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, geography, and philosophy that it had never had direct access to before. Arabic translations of Aristotle eventually made their way back into Western Europe, where scholars like Thomas Aquinas worked to integrate classical philosophy directly into Christian theology. Medical texts written by physicians such as Avicenna went on to influence European universities for centuries afterward. Navigation techniques improved, maps grew steadily more accurate, knowledge traveled right alongside merchants and pilgrims moving in both directions. There's a real irony in the fact that wars fought explicitly in the name of religion ended up contributing to one of history's greatest exchanges of learning between two civilizations. The Crusades transformed military practice across Europe too. European armies encountered unfamiliar weapons and tactics abroad and had to learn, sometimes painfully, to fight in unfamiliar climates against highly mobile cavalry, unlike anything they'd trained against back home. Castle design evolved rapidly as a direct result. Massive concentric fortresses like Crac des Chevaliers demonstrated entirely new approaches to defensive architecture that went on to influence military building projects throughout Europe for generations. Siege warfare grew increasingly sophisticated as well, with engineers developing improved trebuchets, siege towers, and fortification techniques through years of hard practical experience. Military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller created permanent, professional fighting organizations unlike anything Europe had previously known, blending monastic discipline with military structure in an entirely new way. The sheer experience of campaigning thousands of miles from home also pushed forward real advances in logistics, supply systems, and long-distance organization that armies would rely on for centuries afterward. The Crusades gradually reshaped the political landscape of Europe as well. Many nobles exhausted their family wealth financing these long expeditions, and some never returned home at all. Their lands ended up inherited, sold off, or simply absorbed by stronger rivals in their absence. As powerful feudal families declined one by one, kings across Europe increasingly consolidated authority in their own hands. The crusading movement also, somewhat indirectly, strengthened institutions capable of organizing taxation, diplomacy, and administration across genuinely large territories, skills that outlasted the Crusades themselves. Meanwhile, the papacy reached the very height of its political influence during the earlier crusading era. For a time, the Pope held an almost unparalleled ability to mobilize rulers across the entire continent behind a single cause. Repeated military failures, though, eventually chipped away at that prestige. The Fourth Crusade, in particular, revealed just how easily papal intentions could be overtaken entirely by political and economic realities well beyond Rome's control. Few states suffered more from the overall crusading period than the Byzantine Empire itself, which is a genuine irony worth sitting with for a moment. The First Crusade had begun, at least in part, as a direct response to an appeal from Emperor Alexios Komnenos, who had simply sought military assistance against the Seljuk Turks threatening his borders. Instead, over the following century, relations between Byzantium and the Crusaders steadily deteriorated rather than improved. Catastrophe finally arrived in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade captured and thoroughly looted Constantinople itself. Although the Byzantines eventually regained their own capital decades later, the empire never fully recovered its former strength. Its economy weakened permanently. Its population declined. Its military resources diminished year after year. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople for good in 1453, the empire had already been profoundly weakened by events set in motion generations earlier during the crusading period itself. For many Orthodox Christians even today, the memory of 1204 remains one of the deepest and most painful wounds in the whole of Christian history. The Crusades transformed the Muslim world in significant ways too. Muslim rulers had often been sharply divided by regional rivalries before this period began in earnest. Leaders like Nur al-Din, Saladin, and later the Mamluk sultans presented resistance to the Crusaders as both a genuine political and religious mission simultaneously, and Jerusalem itself grew into an increasingly powerful symbol within Islamic memory as a result. Although the Crusader kingdoms eventually disappeared entirely from the map, memories of the foreign invasion that had produced them lingered on for centuries afterward. Political leaders and historians alike would go on referencing the Crusades for generations whenever discussing relations between the Middle East and Europe more broadly. In many ways, the historical memory of the Crusades proved every bit as influential over time as the actual events themselves had been. One of the darkest legacies to emerge from this entire period touched Europe's own Jewish population directly. Before many Crusader armies had even reached the Holy Land in the first place, certain groups attacked Jewish communities along the Rhine, as we noted earlier. Cities including Speyer, Worms, and Mainz witnessed serious massacres in 1096 alone. Many bishops attempted to protect their Jewish residents from these mobs, and some succeeded in doing so, though many others could not prevent the violence from unfolding regardless. These attacks were never part of Urban's original appeal, nor did they represent the actions of every crusader by any means. Still, they revealed clearly how religious fervor, mixed with fear, rumor, and existing prejudice, could combine into something genuinely devastating for innocent communities caught up in events far beyond their control. For Jewish communities across Europe, the Crusades marked a genuine turning point in the long history of medieval persecution, and the memory of it endured for many generations to come. The Crusades remain, even now, among the most misunderstood events in the whole of history. Some modern portrayals present them as purely defensive wars fought to protect Christian lands. Others describe them as nothing more than early acts of colonial aggression dressed up in religious language. Neither interpretation really captures the full complexity of what actually happened across 2 centuries of shifting motives and circumstances. The Crusades involved genuine religious devotion alongside real political ambition, economic interest, meaningful cultural encounter, extraordinary acts of individual courage, and terrible episodes of senseless violence, sometimes all within the same campaign. Different crusades pursued genuinely different objectives from one another. Different leaders pursued different personal goals throughout. The whole movement evolved considerably over its 2-century span, and no single tidy explanation can fully account for its entire history. Like most truly great historical events, the Crusades resist easy, simple judgment from any single angle. Even after nearly 1,000 years, the Crusades continue shaping historical memory in very different ways depending on where you look. In Europe, they're often remembered as part of a broader medieval struggle between Christianity and Islam. Across much of the Middle East, they're frequently recalled instead as a prolonged period of foreign invasion. Within Christianity itself, they remain an ongoing subject of theological reflection and genuine historical debate to this day. Modern historians increasingly emphasize understanding over simple myth-making, seeking to explain why ordinary people believed what they believed at the time, why rulers made the particular choices they made, and how a movement born from sincere faith ultimately produced consequences that reached far beyond religion alone. So were the Crusades, in the end, a success? The honest answer really depends on which question you're actually asking. Did they permanently recover Jerusalem for Christendom? No, they didn't. Did they establish lasting Crusader kingdoms that endured? No, those eventually fell too. Did they reshape world history in lasting, undeniable ways? Absolutely they did. The Crusades accelerated trade between distant regions, expanded the exchange of knowledge across civilizations, transformed the practice of warfare itself, strengthened some kingdoms while weakening others, deepened lasting divisions between Christians and Muslims, and permanently altered the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity. They remind us, more than anything, that history is rarely defined only by who wins on any given battlefield. Sometimes its greatest consequences only unfold long after the actual fighting has ended. The Crusaders set out believing they could change the Holy Land forever. In the end, what they actually changed was the wider world itself, in ways far larger than any of them could have possibly imagined at the start. Picture Jerusalem at sunrise even today. Golden light spills across ancient limestone walls that have witnessed more history than perhaps anywhere else on earth. Bells ring out from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The call to prayer echoes from the Al-Aqsa Mosque nearby. Jewish worshippers gather quietly before the stones of the Western Wall. 3 great faiths, sharing one ancient city, nearly 1,000 years after the events we've spent tonight walking through together. The armies are long gone now. The banners once carried by kings and sultans disappeared centuries ago. The Crusader castles that once guarded the roads to the Holy City stand today as weathered ruins overlooking quiet, peaceful valleys. Swords have rusted into nothing. Siege towers vanished long ago. The kingdoms the Crusaders built have become nothing more than chapters in history books. And yet the memory of those 2 centuries has never fully faded from the world it helped shape. The Crusades changed far more than the ownership of a single city, however sacred that city was and remains. They transformed Europe, they reshaped the Middle East, they strengthened certain kingdoms while weakening others, expanded trade routes, accelerated the exchange of knowledge, and permanently altered the relationship between Christianity and Islam going forward. They also left wounds carried quietly in the memories of Christians, of Muslims, of Jews, of a Byzantine world that watched fellow Christians sack its greatest city, and of ordinary families across 2 continents who lost fathers, sons, daughters, and homes across generations of conflict most of them never fully understood. History rarely offers simple, tidy stories, and the Crusades certainly don't. To some people, they represent extraordinary acts of faith and sacrifice. To others, they became lasting symbols of conquest and suffering. Both perspectives hold real elements of truth inside them. The men and women who took the cross were never simply saints, nor were they simply conquerors driven purely by greed. They were, in the end, ordinary human beings. Some were moved by profound devotion, some sought honor, some hoped for forgiveness, some dreamed of glory. Others simply followed the people around them into a future none of them could have clearly imagined in advance. The Muslim rulers who opposed them were every bit as complex in turn. Some sought peace above all else. Others sought outright victory. Many were simply defending lands that had already been part of the Islamic world for centuries before any crusader ever arrived. Leaders like Saladin became admired across both cultures, not only for military success, but for diplomacy, restraint, and genuine political wisdom as well. Even the greatest figures to emerge from this whole era resist easy, simple labels in the end. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson this remarkable chapter of history has to offer us. Faith stands among the most powerful forces humanity has ever known. It can inspire people to cross entire continents for a cause larger than themselves. It can inspire genuine generosity, real courage, quiet endurance, and lasting hope. Yet when that same faith gets joined with fear, political ambition, or the raw pursuit of power, it can also become a force capable of extraordinary destruction. The Crusades remind us, gently but firmly, that religion and politics have rarely existed in true isolation from one another throughout human history. Kings sought crowns, popes sought influence, merchants sought trade, empires sought security. Ordinary people sought salvation, each of them believing sincerely that they were pursuing something genuinely worth sacrificing for. Together, all of them combined to create one of the longest and most influential conflicts of the entire medieval world. The roads once travelled by crusading armies are today crossed instead by pilgrims, scholars, and quiet visitors from every corner of the world. Where soldiers once marched toward battle, people now come seeking simple understanding instead. The castles have slowly become museums. The old battlefields have become farmland again. The cities themselves continue living on, the way cities always do. History moves steadily forward, generation after generation, but it never entirely leaves us behind either, not really. The story of the Crusades belongs not only to medieval Europe or the medieval Middle East. It belongs, in a quieter way, to all of us who try to understand how religion and politics, hope and violence, conviction and compromise have shaped the long human experience across the centuries. And in that particular sense, the Crusades aren't merely a distant chapter of the past sealed away behind us. They remain, even now, something closer to a mirror, one in which the modern world can still recognize a little of itself, if it looks closely enough. The night has grown deep now, and our long story has reached its quiet close. Let the names and dates settle gently behind you: Clermont and Nicaea, Antioch and Jerusalem, Hattin and Constantinople, all of it drifting softly out of focus now, like a landscape seen from a slowing train. There's nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. If you're still awake, there's another long journey waiting whenever you're ready for it. And if tonight's story gave you something worth having, you're always welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a thought down in the comments below. But for now, let all of that go completely. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and still. Close your eyes and let yourself rest. This has been Deep History Origins. Good night and sweet dreams.